Grace Miller's voice was barely a whisper as she clutched her phone in the deserted hallway. "I don't have anywhere to go. No one here even realizes I exist." She had no idea that just beyond the corner, the company's CEO was standing still, hearing every word. That single accidental moment of being overheard would set events in motion that would change both of their lives. Grace had always believed herself invisible, but she was about to discover that someone had been quietly paying attention to her for years. Only 20 minutes earlier, she had been sitting in her car in the parking garage, her wedding ring glinting under the dim light, as Ryan's confession replayed in her mind. Now, on the 32nd floor, she tried to gather the courage to pack her desk and leave Grant Media forever. This towering glass skyscraper, home to 37 floors of ruthless ambition, was a place where Grace worked as a mere administrative assistant, unseen in the shadows of power. It was a world ruled by people like Madison Sharp, the HR director, who wore cruelty as effortlessly as her designer suits. In this place, conversations halted when Grace entered a room, and her ideas dissolved into silence before they could ever take root. The girl from a small town in Ohio had learned to shrink herself smaller every day, filing papers, fetching coffee, while her bright mind went unnoticed. She opened her battered leather journal, its pages filled with words no one else would ever read. In her careful script, one entry caught the morning light. "I wonder what it feels like to matter to someone. To have your words actually reach another person's heart and leave a mark." But this was no ordinary diary. Within those pages were marketing strategies that could reshape how companies built relationships with clients, letters that could repair broken trust, ideas powerful enough to transform entire businesses. Yet Grace doubted anyone would ever care what an invisible assistant thought, someone who even apologized for taking up space in elevators. What she didn't realize was that Ethan Grant, the man in the corner office, had been noticing her for a long time. Just yesterday, he had overheard her quiet confession. "No one in this office even knows I exist." But Ethan knew better. For 3 years, he had been watching her gentle kindness, her sharp observations, the way she paid attention when others were busy performing. In his desk lay a folder marked GM, filled with notes collected over the years about the assistant who thought she was nobody, but who in truth saw everything. And now, Grace's story of recognition was about to unfold. The shy young woman who thought herself invisible was about to discover that the right person had been seeing her all along, and soon she would learn that the quietest voices often carry the most extraordinary power. Relationships, he was learning, required the very humanity he'd been avoiding. They needed someone who could write with heart, who understood what it meant to be vulnerable and authentic. He pulled out a thin folder from his desk drawer, one he'd been keeping for months. GM was written on the tab, observations about the quiet assistant who seemed to understand people in ways his senior staff missed. Her thoughtful questions during client meetings, the way she remembered personal details about visitors, her instinct for reading between the lines of what clients really needed. He'd been watching, wondering if there was more to Grace Miller than anyone realized. That afternoon, Grace found herself working late again. The office had emptied except for security and a few dedicated workaholics. She pulled out a blank document and began typing. Not official work, just words that had been building pressure inside her for weeks. A letter to potential clients that spoke about trust, about partnership, about the courage it takes to grow a business, and the faith required to choose the right people to grow with. It was motivational writing that came from the heart, the kind that could inspire action and build lasting relationships. The words flowed like they'd been waiting their whole lives to be written. She wrote about understanding, about seeing beyond numbers, to the dreams and fears that drive every decision, about the privilege of being trusted with someone's vision. When she finished, Grace stared at the screen. It was everything she wished. She could say in those morning meetings everything she believed about connecting with people authentically. But who would ever read it? Who would ever care what the invisible assistant had to say? She saved the document and was about to close her laptop when James appeared beside her desk. "Working late again?" he asked gently. "Grace, you know you don't have to prove yourself by staying here all hours. I was just writing something, personal stuff." She moved to close the document, but James caught a glimpse of the screen. "Wait," he said, his eyes scanning the first few lines. "Grace, this is incredible. Is this about client communications?" She nodded reluctantly. "Just ideas I had. Nothing official." "My cousin works at Morrison Group," James said, excitement building in his voice. "They've been complaining for months about getting generic marketing pitches that don't understand their mission. Grace, would you mind if I showed him this? Not officially, just as a friend." Grace hesitated. "I don't know, James. If Madison found out, she won't. I'll just send it as a sample of thoughtful writing. No names, no company letterhead, just good communication." James's enthusiasm was infectious. "Grace, what's the worst that could happen? They ignore it. But what if they don't?" For just a moment, Grace paused. Two lonely people separated by 36 floors and a universe of corporate hierarchy, both searching for connection in different ways. She almost knocked, almost asked if he needed coffee or if there was anything she could do to help. Instead, she walked away, leaving him to his solitude and herself to hers. Neither of them knew that tomorrow everything would change. Neither of them knew that Grace's words were about to become the bridge between the heart she kept hidden and the recognition she'd never dared to hope for. But sometimes the universe has plans that go far beyond what we can see. And Grace Miller was about to discover that being invisible doesn't mean being powerless. 3 days later, Grace sat at her desk, trying to focus on filing reports, but her mind kept drifting to the letter she'd written. James had been unusually quiet, avoiding her eyes when they passed in the hallway. She wondered if he'd actually sent her words to his cousin, and if so, what kind of rejection they'd received. The morning meeting began at 9 sharp, but today felt different. There was intention in the air that Grace couldn't identify. Madison seemed agitated, her usual composed demeanor slightly frayed at the edges. "They're walking away from a $2 million partnership," he said, his voice steady despite the frustration burning in his chest. "Their exact words were that our communications lack emotional intelligence and authentic human connection." Madison shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Sir, I can revise our approach. Maybe something more personal?" "Personal." Ethan's gray eyes were winter cold. "I'm Madison. You've been handling client communications for 18 months. If you could fix this, it would be fixed." The room fell silent. Grace, taking notes in her corner, felt the tension like electricity in the air. She'd read the original proposal. Madison had sent to Morrison Group. It was technically perfect and emotionally vacant, exactly the kind of corporate speak that made companies feel like account numbers instead of partners. "What we need," Ethan continued, pacing to the window, "is someone who understands that business is fundamentally about human relationships, someone who can write with both professionalism and heart." Grace's pulse quickened. She thought of the letter she'd written last night, still saved in her personal folder, the words that had poured out of her like they'd been waiting a lifetime to be spoken. "I could try," she said quietly. The room turned to stare at her. Madison's expression shifted from surprise to something darker. "Grace," Madison said with that patronizing sweetness, "that's really not your area of expertise. Client communications require a certain level of sophistication." "What kind of sophistication?" Grace asked, finding her voice stronger than expected. "Strategic thinking, marketing psychology, understanding what high-level executives want to hear." Madison's smile was razor-thin. "It's not about feelings, Grace. It's about results. But what if feelings are the result?" Grace stood, her notebook clutched against her chest like armor. What if the reason we're losing clients is because we're treating them like transactions instead of people Ethan's attention focused on her with? Laser intensity. Go on. Grace felt every eye in the room. 3 years of silence, of swallowing her ideas, of being dismissed and overlooked. But Ryan's words echoed in her memory. You're so invisible, Grace. Maybe it was time to become visible. Morrison Group isn't just buying our services, she said, her voice gaining strength. They're trusting us with their reputation, their growth, their dreams. The letter we sent them could have been sent to any company. It didn't see them. It didn't understand what makes them unique or why they started their business in the first place. Madison's laugh was sharp. Grace, you're an administrative assistant. You file papers and answer phones. You don't understand the complexities of executive-level communications, don't I? Grace opened her notebook pages filled with observations about every client who'd walked through their doors. Mr. Morrison started his company after his father's small business failed because they couldn't get good marketing support. He's not looking for another vendor. He's looking for partners who won't let him down the way his father was let down. The room was absolutely silent now. Ethan leaned forward. How do you know that? Because I listen, Grace said simply. When clients wait in the lobby, when they make small talk by the elevator, when they're on phone calls they think no one cares about, people tell their stories all the time. We just don't hear them. Madison's face had gone pale, but her voice remained sharp. This is ridiculous. Grace, you're overstepping here. Ethan, surely you're not going to let an assistant? Let me read something. Grace interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. She pulled up the letter on her phone, the one she'd written in the quiet of last night's solitude. This is what I would have sent to Morrison Group. She began to read, her voice, carrying the emotion she'd poured into every word. She spoke about understanding the weight of trust, about partnerships built on seeing each other clearly, about having someone in your corner who believes in your vision even when the path gets difficult. The words transformed the sterile conference room into something warmer, more human. When she finished, the silence was different. Not empty, but full. Ethan was staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time. You wrote that last night after the meeting where Grace glanced at Madison where my ideas weren't quite sophisticated enough. Madison's composure cracked. Ethan, you can't seriously be considering, actually. Ethan said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. I am. He turned to Grace. Do you have more like this? Grace nodded, hardly believing what was happening. I want to see everything. Every idea you've had about our client communications, every observation you've made. His gray eyes were intense but no longer cold. And I want you to rewrite every piece of correspondence that's gone out in the last 6 months. Madison stood abruptly. This is insane. She's an assistant, Ethan. She doesn't have the education, the experience. She has something better, Ethan said, never taking his eyes off Grace. She has the ability to see people as human beings instead of profit margins. Grace felt tears threatening, but held them back. For the first time in years, maybe in her life, someone was truly listening to her. There's something else, James said from the doorway, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. Everyone turned to see him holding a folder. Grace, I need to tell you something. Remember that letter you wrote? I sent it to my cousin at Morrison Group 3 days ago. Grace's heart stopped. You what? He called me this morning. They want a meeting with whoever wrote it. They said it was the first piece of communication from any marketing firm that actually understood their mission. James looked around the room. But there's a problem. My cousin asked around their office trying to figure out which firm sent such insightful writing. Word got back to Madison yesterday. Madison's face had gone ashen, but her voice remained sharp. That's right. I received a call from Morrison Group asking about our anonymous submission. When I explained we hadn't sent anything, anonymously they described the content. It sounded suspiciously like the ideas Grace had been inappropriately sharing in meetings. Inappropriately sharing. Grace's voice was stronger than she felt. I had to inform them that one of our junior staff may have been communicating with potential clients without authorization. Madison continued her smile predatory. It's a serious breach of protocol. I've already filed a report with HR about your unauthorized contact with Morrison Group. Ethan stood slowly, and Grace could see something shifting in his expression. Recognition, respect, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. Grace Miller, he said, and her name sounded different in his voice, not dismissive or forgotten, but weighted with new possibility. I believe it's time we talked. In this moment, Grace realized that being invisible hadn't made her powerless. It had given her the superpower of truly seeing others. And now, finally, someone was seeing her too. The elevator ride to the 37th floor felt like ascending to another world. Grace had never been above the 20th floor, never imagined she'd be standing in Ethan Grant's corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and view of the entire city. But here she was, portfolio in hand, heart hammering against her ribs. Sit, please, Ethan said, gesturing to the leather chairs that probably cost more than Grace made in a month. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a sleek machine, his movements careful and deliberate. How do you take it? Just black, Grace said, then immediately worried. That sounded too simple, not sophisticated enough for this office, this moment. Like your writing? Straightforward? No unnecessary additions. He handed her the cup, their fingers brushing briefly. Grace, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. She nodded, not trusting her voice. How long have you been watching us fail at something you knew how to fix? The question was so direct, so unexpected, that Grace almost choked on her coffee. What do you mean? How long have you been sitting in that corner desk watching us send out communications that sound like they were written by robots, knowing you could do better? His gray eyes weren't angry, just infinitely curious. How long have you been invisible while having all the answers? Grace set down her cup with shaking hands. 3 years, she whispered. 3 years. He leaned back in his chair. And in all that time, no one ever asked for your input. No one ever thought to find out what the woman who processes all our client feedback might have learned about what works and what doesn't. Madison always said, I don't care what Madison said. Ethan's voice was quiet, but firm. I'm asking you. Grace felt something breaking open inside her chest. Years of swallowed words, dismissed ideas, silenced insights. I wanted to help. I wrote dozens of drafts, alternative approaches. I studied every client we lost, trying to understand what went wrong. But I'm just an assistant. I figured I didn't understand the bigger picture. Show me, he said, simply. For the next hour, Grace spread her notebooks across his mahogany desk. Pages of client profiles that went beyond demographics to capture their hopes and fears. Campaign concepts that spoke to the heart of what each company was trying to build. Letters that transformed business relationships into human connections. Each page told a heartwarming story of understanding, proof that authentic care could bridge any professional divide. Ethan read in silence, occasionally, making soft sounds of surprise or recognition. When he finished the last page, he looked up at Grace with something that might have been wonder. Do you know what you are? He asked. Grace shook her head. You're what every company claims to want, but rarely finds. You're someone who genuinely cares about connecting with people, who sees beyond the transaction to the relationship. He gestured to her notebooks. This isn't just good writing, Grace. This is inspirational communication at the highest level, the kind that motivates real change and builds lasting partnerships. I listen to people. Really listen. That's exactly my point. Ethan stood and walked to the window. I built this company on the idea that business should be personal, that relationships matter more than quick profits. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I got so focused on growth and efficiency that I forgot about the human element. He turned back to her. You never forgot. Even when no one was listening to you, you kept seeing people as people. Grace felt tears threatening again. It didn't seem like much. It's everything. Ethan returned to his desk, pulling out a contract. I'm creating a new position, Director of Client Relations. Your job would be to humanize every piece of communication that goes out of this company to make sure we're not just talking to accounts, but to the real people behind those businesses. Grace stared at the contract, the numbers swimming before her eyes. The salary was triple what she'd been making. The title was something she'd never dared to dream of. I don't have an MBA, she said quietly. I don't have a marketing degree or public relations experience. You have something better. You have wisdom. Ethan's voice was gentle but certain. Grace, I've been in business for 15 years. I can teach someone's strategy and tactics in a few months, but what you have the ability to truly see and understand people that can't be taught. It's a gift. Grace looked up at him, really looked, and saw something she hadn't expected. Behind the CEO authority and expensive suit was someone who looked as lonely as she felt. Someone who'd built walls around his heart and was just now remembering what it felt like to connect authentically with another person. Why? She asked. Why now? Why me? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. 2 years ago, I lost my wife in a car accident. I threw myself into work, convinced that if I just built the company big enough, successful enough, the pain would go away. But success without connection is just expensive emptiness. He walked back to the window, his voice softer now. Yesterday, I heard you on the phone saying you felt invisible, that no one knew you existed. And I realized I'd been making myself invisible, too, hiding behind titles and corner offices. Maybe it's time we both stepped into the light. Grace stood slowly, the contract in her hands, feeling like a bridge between who she'd been and who she might become. What about Madison? Madison will adjust to the new reality or find opportunities elsewhere, Ethan said with finality. What matters now is making sure Morrison Group and every client after them knows they're partnering with people who genuinely care about their success. Grace signed the contract with hands that had stopped shaking. As she wrote her name, she thought about Ryan, about his cruel words about her invisibility. He'd been wrong. She hadn't been invisible. She'd been gathering strength, learning, preparing for this moment when her voice would finally matter. There's one more thing, Ethan said as she handed back the signed papers. I want you to know that someone has been listening all along. Every insight you shared, every moment of caring you showed, I saw it. Maybe I didn't act on it soon enough, but I saw it. Grace felt something shift inside her like a door opening after years of being locked. She wasn't invisible anymore. She never had been. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to shine. Sometimes the greatest transformations happen, not when we change who we are, but when we finally have the courage to show the world who we've always been. 2 months later, Grace stood in the same conference room where Madison had once dismissed her ideas. But everything had changed. The table was surrounded by senior executives from Morrison Group, their faces bright with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from feeling truly understood. The campaign is extraordinary, Mr. Morrison was saying, shaking Grace's hand with both of his. For the first time in 15 years of working with marketing firms, I felt like someone actually heard our story. My father would have loved this approach. Grace smiled, the warmth spreading through her chest like sunlight. Your father's story is what inspired every word. Building something meaningful isn't just about profit, it's about legacy. Ethan watched, from the corner of the room, pride evident in his expression. Over the past 2 months, Grace had transformed not just their client communications, but the entire culture of the company. People lingered in meetings, now sharing ideas instead of just checking boxes. The office felt more human, more connected. After the Morrison group left, Ethan found Grace at her new desk, not tucked away in a corner anymore, but positioned where she could see and be seen, where people naturally stopped by to share ideas and ask for advice. "How does it feel?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Like I'm finally breathing," Grace said, then laughed softly at how dramatic that sounded. "I mean, I knew I had ideas, but I never imagined they could actually make a difference. You've made more than a difference. You've made this place remember what it means to be human." Ethan's voice was warm with admiration. "The Richardson account signed yesterday specifically because they said our communications felt authentic. The Hartwell Group extended their contract early because they trust us to understand their vision, not just execute tasks." Grace felt that familiar flutter of disbelief that this was really her life now. "Sometimes I still can't believe it's real." "Speaking of real," Ethan said, her expression softened, then grew more serious. "I heard Ryan's been calling again," Ethan said quietly. Grace nodded, her fingers instinctively touching the empty space where her wedding ring had once rested. "Third time this week. He keeps begging for another chance. Says Sarah meant nothing, that it was all a mistake. His lawyer even reached out to discuss reconciliation." Her voice was calm, almost too calm. But the real mistake wasn't Sarah. The real mistake was spending 8 years married to a man who never actually saw me. Yesterday, I filed for divorce. Because I deserve more than being invisible. I deserve to be valued while I'm still here. Not only after I've left. Honestly, realizing that felt liberating. Ethan studied her with quiet admiration. "That sounds like something you'd write to your clients. Something about truly being seen and about authentic connection." Grace gave a small laugh. "Maybe it is. I'm starting to realize the same lessons apply everywhere. In business, in life, in love. For years, I accepted invisibility because I thought that was all I was worth. But not anymore." Her gaze swept over the office, the co-workers who now turned to her for advice, the pile of handwritten thank you notes from clients who finally felt understood. "Now I know I'm worth being noticed, worth being heard, worth taking up space in this world." Ethan opened his desk drawer and pulled out a slim folder marked GM. "Grace, I need to be honest with you. I've been keeping notes about you for months." Her eyes widened and he quickly added, "Not in a strange way. I just noticed things. How you remembered that Mr. Peterson's daughter was starting college. How you offered water or coffee to clients. Not because it was your job, but because you genuinely cared. How you listened not only to their words, but to what they couldn't bring themselves to say." Later that evening, when the office had emptied out, Grace stood at the break room window, the same spot where she used to eat lunch alone every day. But tonight she wasn't alone. Ethan appeared beside her, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. "I wanted to thank you," he said, offering her one. "For what?" she asked. "For reminding me what this company should stand for. For showing me that without connection, all the success in the world is just empty loneliness." He paused, watching the city lights glitter outside. "And about what you said, accepting the love we think we deserve. I think I've been guilty of that, too. Accepting isolation, because I believed it was all I deserved after losing Emma." Grace studied his face, seeing the vulnerability he rarely let slip. "Grief convinces us that joy is forbidden, that moving forward somehow betrays what we lost. It tricks us into believing we're unworthy of happiness." Her voice was soft, but steady. "But worth isn't something we have to earn. It's already within us. The only challenge is daring to believe it." When Ethan turned to look at her, there was something new in his gray eyes. Hope, possibility, the courage to open himself again. "Grace Miller," he said, and her name sounded different this time. Not as an employee, not as someone overlooked, but as someone deeply valued. "Would you have dinner with me? Not as boss and assistant, as two people finally choosing to step into the light together." Grace felt her heart do something it hadn't done in years, leap with joy at the possibility of being loved, not despite her quiet strength, but because of it. "I'd like that very much," she said with a smile. And in that quiet moment, standing side by side with coffee cups in hand, Grace realized her story wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about finally being brave enough to be who she always was, a woman worth hearing, worth loving, worth seeing. The invisible had become radiant, not by changing herself, but by being recognized. And sometimes that's the only transformation that matters. Because true love begins when we believe we are worthy of being seen, and when we find the courage to truly see someone else in return.